Step back, old man, or you're next. Those were the words SWAT Officer Keller shouted before pulling the trigger on his taser, sending 65-year-old Evelyn Martin crumpling to the driveway, groceries spilling in every direction. Her husband, Samuel Martin, lay zip-tied on the concrete engine grease on his fingers and a boot in his back. But instead of shouting or pleading, Samuel calmly lifted his head, locked eyes with the team's commander, and said 5 words that brought the entire operation to a standstill. Call General Rourke right now. It started as a case of mistaken identity. The SWAT team had raided 4898 Oakwood Drive, but their suspect lived on Oakwood Avenue. A simple error with devastating consequences. The tactical team never expected that the quiet man they just restrained was a retired Tier 1 operative, with a record buried deeper than most of them had clearance to see. When they searched Samuel's jacket and found a worn metallic badge with a Black Eagle insignia, known only to a few, they began to realize their mistake. Moments later, an unmarked military SUV pulled up, and out stepped General James Rourke. What happened next wasn't a press conference, it was a reckoning. Because the man they just humiliated, he was the one who wrote the rules they'd just broken. And all it took were 5 words to remind them. True authority doesn't need volume, it just needs truth. To everyone on the quiet street of Maple Glen, Samuel Martin was just the old guy with the open garage, the one who always had a wrench in hand and a 70s rock song humming through the radio. His fingers, gnarled with age and engine grease, had repaired more lawnmowers, Buicks, and broken alternators than anyone could count. People knew him as generous, steady, and quiet, just a good neighbor. But what they didn't know, what most were never supposed to know, was that Samuel had once walked paths no civilian could imagine. 27 years in military intelligence, multiple classified operations, and a service record that lived in sealed files buried deep in the Pentagon's archives. His medals weren't on display, they were kept in an old shoebox behind his toolbox. That's how Samuel wanted it. He had already spent a lifetime in chaos. What he wanted now was peace. His wife Evelyn knew everything, the missions, the silence, the scars. She had stood by him through it all, deployments without explanations, nights haunted by memories he couldn't share, and the long journey of reintegration into civilian life. Together, they built a modest, meaningful life. He volunteered at the local VFW every Thursday. On Saturdays, he built wheelchair ramps for fellow veterans. And on Tuesdays, he taught high school students how to rebuild engines, especially the ones other teachers had given up on. Then came that Wednesday afternoon. While changing the oil in a neighbor's car, Samuel heard the screech of tires. A convoy of black SUVs roared into his driveway. Tactical officers in full gear stormed the lawn. Guns were drawn. Orders were shouted. Within seconds, Samuel was face down on the ground, zip-tied, accused of crimes he hadn't even heard of. They were looking for a drug dealer, but they were at the wrong house. Then Evelyn came home. Carrying groceries, confused and frightened, she was given no time to react. Within moments, she was tased, her body collapsing in front of her husband as eggs burst across the concrete and milk soaked the pavement. Samuel watched in silence, but he wasn't powerless. With calm, quiet strength, he looked at the SWAT commander and said the 5 words that stopped everything: call General Rourke right now. What followed was a scene no one on that street would ever forget. Military verification, a special badge, a visit from General James Rourke, who stepped out of a black SUV and saluted Samuel on his front porch. It was the first salute Samuel had received in over 15 years. That day, the tactical team realized the man they had thrown to the ground wasn't a suspect. He was the architect of the very engagement protocols they had failed to follow. But Samuel didn't scream. He didn't demand revenge. He knelt beside his wife, helped her up, and said one sentence that defined everything about him. Now my service is to her. Officer Ryan Mitchell had always believed in doing the right thing. Fresh out of the academy, he stood tall in his uniform, convinced he was ready for the weight of authority. But nothing in his training had prepared him for the moment when he pointed a taser at a 65-year-old woman holding groceries and pulled the trigger. It happened in seconds. The team had stormed the house, adrenaline high, targeting what they believed was a high-level suspect. When Evelyn Martin stepped out of her car, her confusion was misread as noncompliance. Ryan's voice cracked as he shouted orders. She didn't move fast enough. He panicked. And then came the sound, the sharp pop of electricity firing, and Evelyn collapsed to the driveway, eggs and milk scattering across the concrete. Her husband, Samuel Martin, restrained on the ground, didn't scream. He didn't curse. He simply locked eyes with the team's commander and spoke 5 words that made Ryan's heart freeze. Call General Rorick right now. From that moment on, everything unraveled. The wrong address, the wrong suspect, and the wrong assumptions that led to an innocent woman getting hurt. When General James Rorick arrived and removed Ryan's badge and sidearm on the spot, it wasn't done in anger, it was done in silence. A silence that weighed more than any punishment Ryan could have imagined. He was sent home, not fired but suspended pending reassignment. But it wasn't the suspension that kept him awake at night. It was the image of Samuel kneeling beside his wife. The man Ryan had humiliated helping the woman Ryan had hurt. And then came the letter. 2 weeks later, Ryan found a note slipped under his door. It was handwritten, no return address. Just a few lines. Regret is only useful if it changes who you are. If you're ready to learn, come by the garage, Roy. It was signed not Mr. Martin or Sergeant, but simply Roy. Ryan showed up the next day. He didn't know what to expect, but there was Roy under a Buick grease on his hands, same as always. He didn't mention the incident, didn't ask for an apology. He just handed Ryan a wrench and said, "You ever change an oil filter without making a mess?" From that moment, Ryan came by every week. He learned about engines, patience, and the quiet discipline that can't be taught in classrooms. He learned that respect isn't just a protocol, it's a posture. A way of moving through the world without assuming you know who people are. Months later, when another rookie officer made a flippant comment about a grumpy old vet during a routine call, it was Ryan who stepped in. He didn't raise his voice. He just said, "Don't assume. Listen first." And when they asked him why he cared so much, he simply replied, "Because one day I didn't, and someone else paid the price." Sometimes the worst mistakes teach us the best lessons. Ryan Mitchell didn't just learn about law enforcement, he learned about humility, about grace, and about a man who, even after being disrespected, chose to extend his hand rather than raise his voice. And that choice changed more than just one young officer. It changed the department. It changed the culture. And it started with 5 words. When the black SUV sped away and the military saluted, you would have expected Samuel Martin to want cameras, press conferences, and apologies delivered on national television. But Samuel didn't ask for recognition. He didn't even ask for revenge. The man who had once written the very rules the SWAT team had broken simply helped his wife to her feet, closed his garage door, and returned to his quiet life, one of engines, community service, and quiet integrity. But the town noticed. Neighbors who once waved politely now approached with a new reverence. Mrs. Henderson, whose Buick Samuel had been repairing when it all happened, left homemade pies on his porch for weeks. The local high school principal asked him to speak to students not about war or tactics, but about resilience and grace. Even the officers who once passed his house without thought began slowing down when driving by. Some would stop and nod. A few left handwritten notes of apology. A couple even asked if he needed help carrying tools. But the change went beyond individual gestures. 3 weeks after the incident, the city council voted unanimously to fund a new de-escalation and accountability training program for all law enforcement modeled after what they now called the 5 words protocol. The training used Samuel's story without naming him to teach officers the vital importance of precision, humility, and above all, respect. The military wasn't silent either. An unmarked black SUV began appearing at Samuel's home once a month. No lights, no press. Just a quiet delivery on the porch, sometimes a book, sometimes a bottle of whiskey, once a weathered photo, blurred faces beside a young Samuel in uniform. Tokens of remembrance, gratitude, and silent honor. And then there was Linda. Though she never spoke publicly about being tased in her own driveway, her strength became a symbol all its own. At the grocery store, she stood taller. At the VFW dinners, she held Samuel's arm firmly, unashamed of the scars, both visible and hidden. She didn't let pain define her, she let it sharpen her dignity. The Martins never asked for their lives to become an example. But that's what happened. Their story echoed not because of what was done to them, but because of how they responded. With clarity, with truth, with unshakable calm. Samuel didn't yell, he didn't retaliate. He simply said 5 words that revealed a deeper truth about how we see people and how often we don't. And in that small town, things began to shift. Young officers read his story on their first day of duty. A bronze plaque was quietly installed near his driveway that read, "Before action ask, before judgment think, before force verify." People began to understand that the strongest man in the room isn't always the loudest or the one in uniform. Sometimes it's the man under the car with grease on his hands and a history no one knows. The man who stands up quietly, not to punish, but to remind the world, respect should come before authority, and sometimes mercy is the greatest strength of all. Weeks had passed since the SWAT raid that left Evelyn Martin bruised and shaken, and her husband Samuel Martin, a retired special operations officer, forcibly zip-tied in his own driveway. But what lingered wasn't just the trauma of the event, it was the silence that followed. A silence not filled with anger, but with reflection, with purpose. Samuel never pressed charges. He never called for careers to be ended. He had the authority, the clearance, and the connections to make people disappear from the force entirely. But that wasn't who he was anymore. He was a man who fixed things, not just engines and carburetors, but people, young officers, confused neighbors, and sometimes even himself. After decades in classified missions where violence was a necessity, Samuel had learned that real strength didn't live in domination but in discipline, in knowing when not to pull the trigger, even when everyone around you was itching to do so. That's why when a local reporter ambushed him outside the VFW weeks later and asked, "Why didn't you fight back? Why not retaliate?" Samuel simply looked into the camera and replied, "Because 5 words were louder than fear. And sometimes the strongest position isn't the one where you're standing over someone else. It's where you're standing your ground." Those words resonated far beyond that small town. They became a quiet mantra for a new generation of officers. They appeared on posters at training academies. They were quoted in civic meetings. And most importantly, they stayed taped to the visors of squad cars across the county. You never know who you're stopping. But Samuel didn't care for attention. His days returned to a routine. Thursday nights at the VFW, Saturday mornings under someone's old pickup, Tuesday afternoons mentoring high school kids who didn't believe in second chances until they met a man who lived his entire life proving them possible. And Evelyn. She never let that day define her. She stood stronger, met the eyes of every officer she passed, and walked beside her husband, not as a victim, but as a survivor. One afternoon, a young officer named Adam Torres, barely a year into the job, had his cruiser break down a few doors from the Martins' home. Before he could even call dispatch, Samuel appeared with a toolbox. They worked together in silence beneath the hood. Then hesitantly, Adam asked, "Sir, they told us you could have ended people's careers that day. Why didn't you?" Samuel didn't look up. He tightened a bolt and wiped his hands on a rag. "Because revenge doesn't fix engines," he said, "and it doesn't fix people either. It wasn't about weakness. It was about choosing something stronger." That's what people began to understand, that true authority doesn't need to humiliate to prove itself. That real power is revealed not when you strike back, but when you stand still and let truth do the speaking. Samuel Martin's legacy wasn't the medals he never displayed or the protocols he once wrote. It was the quiet voice in the moment of chaos, the steady hand that picked his wife off the pavement, the man who reminded a whole generation that the best way to lead is to teach others how to hold their fire. After everything, the wrongful raid, the taser, the bruises on his wife's chest, the fear etched into a quiet September afternoon, Samuel Martin never raised his voice. He didn't sue. He didn't call the media. He didn't even demand apologies. He simply returned to his garage, kept fixing engines, and kept helping people. But his silence wasn't weakness. It was will. The kind forged through years of serving in places the world never knew he had been. The kind that understood some battles are best won with mercy, not might. A week after the incident, a young rookie officer asked him, "Why didn't you destroy their careers?" "You had every right." Samuel's answer was simple: because revenge doesn't fix people. And that's the lesson. In a world that praises outrage and quick retaliation, sometimes the most powerful act is restraint. Not because you're powerless, but because you're wise enough to know that destruction doesn't heal. That real authority comes from compassion. That a legacy is built not in anger, but in how we lift others even when we've been knocked down. If this story moved you, share a comment below in honor of someone who taught you patience, dignity, or grace. And if you believe in stories that restore faith in quiet strength and silent heroes, subscribe to our channel. Help us bring more voices like Samuel Martin's to light, because not all power is loud. Some of it fixes broken things and quietly rebuilds the world.